You don't have to be the greatest detective of all time to recognise the voice of the reader of our first offering. A change is as good as a rest for Benedict Cumberbatch as he reads Part 1 of Franz Kafka's nightmarish Metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Part 1. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous insect. He was lying on his hard, shell-like back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-shaped brown body, banded with reinforcing arches, on top of which the blanket maintained its precarious hold. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in relation to the rest of his bulk, danced ineffectually before his eyes. What has happened to me, he thought. It was not a dream. His room, a normal, though rather too small human room, lay peacefully between the four familiar walls. Above the table, on which a collection of cloth samples had been laid out, Samsa was a travelling salesman, hung the picture that he had recently cut out of a magazine and mounted in a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady in a fur hat and boa. Gregor's eyes then focused on the window and the gloomy weather. You could hear raindrops beating on the metal windowsill. God, he thought. What a strenuous profession I've chosen. All this wretched travelling. These early mornings are very bad for the brain. A man needs his sleep. Oh, to hell with it all. If it hadn't been for my parents, I'd have handed my notice in long ago. Oh well, there's still a gleam of hope. Once I've got the money together to pay back what they owe my boss, it might take another 5 or 6 years, I'll definitely do it. I'll make a fresh start. Meanwhile, though, I'd better get up. My train leaves at 5. And he looked across to the alarm clock that was ticking on the chest of drawers. God almighty, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were moving steadily forwards. Might the alarm not have rung? You could see from the bed that it had been set correctly to go off at 4. It must have rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep calmly through that furniture-shaking racket? Well, he hadn't exactly slept calmly, but that probably meant he had slept all the more soundly. But what should he do now? The next train left at 7. To catch that would mean a frantic rush, and the samples had not been packed, and he wasn't exactly feeling especially fresh and mobile. And even if he did catch the train, he could expect a thundering tirade from his boss, because the office boy would have met the 5 o'clock train and reported his absence long ago. The boy was his boss's lackey, a spineless, mindless creature. While he was considering all this, there was a cautious tap at the door near the top of his bed. "Gregor," called the voice. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you have a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor gave a start when he heard his own voice answer. It was unmistakably his own, but mingling with it, as if from below, was a painful, not-to-be-suppressed squeak that uttered the words clearly only for a second. It had been Gregor's intention to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he confined himself to saying, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm just getting up." Due to the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was presumably not noticeable from the outside, for his mother went shuffling off. But this brief exchange had alerted the other members of the family to the fact that Gregor was still at home, and already his father was knocking at one of the side doors with his fist. "Gregor! Gregor! What is it?" At the door on the other side, however, came the soft, plaintive voice of his sister. "Gregor, aren't you well? Do you need anything?" "Just coming," he replied in both directions, and tried through enunciating as clearly as possible and leaving long pauses between the words to make his voice sound as inconspicuous as possible. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open up, please." But Gregor had no intention of opening the door, and congratulated himself on his prudent habit adopted from his travels of locking all the doors at night, even when he was at home. First of all, he wanted to get up in peace and quiet, and only then think about what to do next. He recalled fairly often having felt some slight pain in bed, possibly as a result of lying awkwardly, which had turned out to be purely illusory once he was up, and he was curious to see how the morning's imaginings would gradually dissolve. Discarding the blanket was simple enough. He only needed to inflate himself a little, and it fell to the floor. But after that, things became more difficult because of his extraordinary girth. He would have needed arms and hands to lift himself up. Instead, he had only his numerous legs that were in constant and multifarious motion and over which he had no control. He tried at first to get the lower part of his body out of the bed, but this lower part, which he had incidentally not yet seen, proved too cumbersome. Progress was so slow, and when at last, having become almost wild, he mustered all his strength and thrust himself recklessly forward, it turned out that he had chosen the wrong direction. He bumped violently against the bottom end of the bed, and the searing pain he felt informed him that it was precisely this lower part of his body that might, for the time being, be the most sensitive. So he tried to get the upper part of his body out of bed first, twisting his head round to the edge of the bed. That was easy enough, and despite his girth and great weight, his body slowly followed the movement of his head. But when, at long last, he had got his head out over the side in mid-air, he became afraid of continuing in this manner, for if he were to fall like that, it would take a miracle for him not to sustain a head injury. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself as the alarm rang once more, and for a short time he lay still, breathing quietly, hoping perhaps that such total silence might bring about a return to normal, everyday reality. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 7:15, I must at all costs be right out of bed." And he now set about rocking the whole length of his body evenly out of bed. If he let himself fall in this way, his head, which he intended to lift sharply as he fell, would presumably be unharmed. His back seemed to be hard. Hitting the carpet would probably cause him no damage. When Gregor was already protruding halfway out of the bed, it occurred to him how simple everything would be if somebody came to his aid. 2 strong people, he had in mind his father and the maid, would be quite enough. Well, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, ought he really call for help? Despite his great predicament, he was unable to suppress a smile at the thought. He had already reached the stage where, if he rocked fairly vigorously, he could scarcely keep his balance, and he would very soon have to make up his mind once and for all, when there was a ring at the apartment door. "Someone from the office," he said to himself, and almost froze while his little legs danced even faster. For a moment all was silent. "They're not answering," Gregor said to himself, seized by some insane hope. But then, of course, as always, the maid strode purposefully to the door and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first word of greeting to know who it was. The chief clerk himself. Why was Gregor, of all people, condemned to work for a firm where the slightest lapse promptly aroused the greatest suspicion? Was it necessary for the chief clerk to come in person? And more as a consequence of the agitation caused by these thoughts than as a result of true resolve, Gregor swung himself out of bed with all his might. There was a loud thump, but it was not a true bang. His fall had been muffled by the carpet, and his back was also more elastic than Gregor supposed. He had not, however, been sufficiently careful with his head, which he banged and which he twisted round and rubbed on the carpet in irritation and pain. "Something's fallen in there," said the chief clerk in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something similar to what had just happened to him might one day happen to the chief clerk. He had to admit this possibility. "Gregor," his father now said from the room on the left, "the chief clerk has come to inquire why you didn't catch the early train. He'd like to have a word with you in person. So please, open up. Good morning, Herr Samsa, came meanwhile the friendly voice of the chief clerk. He's not well, sir, said Gregor's mother. Why else would he miss a train? That boy thinks of nothing but his work. Almost makes me angry that he never goes out in the evening. Fretwork provides his only amusement. He made a little picture frame, for example, which took him 2 or 3 evenings. You'll be amazed at how pretty it is. I'm glad, by the way, that you've come, sir. We'd never have persuaded Gregor to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn. Just coming, said Gregor, slowly and deliberately. I too, madam, can think of no other explanation, said the chief clerk. I hope it's nothing serious, although I have to say that we businessmen are very often obliged for business reasons simply to shrug off a minor indisposition. Can the chief clerk come in now? His father asked impatiently. No, said Gregor. In the room on the left, an embarrassed silence fell. In the room on the right, his sister began to sob. Why was she crying? Because he was not getting up to let the chief clerk in? Because he was in danger of losing his job, and because his boss would then start hounding his parents again about those old debts? There was surely no need to worry about such things. Gregor was still present and hadn't the faintest intention of deserting his family. Herr Samsa, the chief clerk now called out in a louder voice. What is wrong? You barricade yourself in your room, answer nothing but yes or no, and in addition, I only mention this in passing, neglect your professional duties in a frankly quite outrageous manner. Your superior intimated to me this morning a possible explanation for your absence concerning the cash payments that you had been trusted to collect. I virtually gave him my word of honour that there could be no truth in such an explanation, but faced here with your incomprehensible obstinacy, I find myself losing absolutely all inclination to defend you in any way whatsoever, and your position is far from secure. My original intention was to tell you all this privately, but as you are causing me to waste my time here so aimlessly, I see no reason why your good parents should not hear it as well. So, your achievements have recently been most unsatisfactory. It is, of course, not the best season for doing business, we recognize that, but there is no such thing, Herr Samsa, there can be no such thing as a season for doing no business at all. But, sir, cried Gregor, distraught and forgetting everything else in his agitation. I'll open the door immediately, at once. A slight indisposition, a bout of dizziness prevented me from getting up, but now I feel perfectly fit again. All these accusations of yours are quite unfounded, and no one has said a word about them to me. Perhaps you haven't seen the last batch of orders I sent in. Anyway, I'll catch the 8 o'clock train. Don't waste another moment, sir. I'll be in the office myself in no time. Would you kindly pass that on and send my respects to the boss? And while Gregor was blurting all this out and hardly knew what he was saying, he had managed to reach the chest of drawers without difficulty, as a consequence perhaps of the practice he had acquired in bed, and was now trying to haul himself upright. He really did intend to show himself and speak with the chief clerk. He was anxious to find out what the others would say when they saw him. If they took fright, Gregor would have no further responsibility, and he could relax. If, on the other hand, they took it all in their stride, he could, if he hurried, actually be at the station by 8. At first, he kept sliding down the smooth surface of the chest of drawers, but at last he gave himself a final heave and stood upright. He now let himself slump against the back of a nearby chair, gripping it round the edge with his little legs. Having thus gained control over himself, he fell silent, for he was now able to listen to what the chief clerk was saying. Have you understood a single word? The chief clerk was asking his parents. He isn't trying to make fools of us, is he? God forbid! Cried his mother, already in tears. Perhaps he's seriously ill. Greta! Greta! She then cried. Mother? Called his sister from the other side. They were communicating through Gregor's room. You must go to the doctor at once. Gregor is ill. Didn't you hear him talking just now?" "That was the voice of an animal," said the chief clerk. "Anna! Anna!" his father was shouting through the hallway into the kitchen. "Get a locksmith immediately!" And already the two girls were running through the hall and tearing open the apartment door. But Gregor had become much calmer. It was true, then, that they could no longer understand his words, though they had seemed clearer than before, perhaps because his ears had become attuned to them. But at least they could now believe that all was not quite right with him, and were prepared to help. He felt integrated once more into human society, and hoped for great and startling contributions from both the doctor and the locksmith, without really making any clear distinction between them. Complete silence had fallen in the adjoining room. Gregor slowly dragged himself towards the door, pushing the chair in front of him. Then he let go of it and threw himself against the door, where he propped himself up. The pads on the bottom of his little legs were slightly adhesive. He then set about turning the key in the lock with his mouth. His jaws were very strong. With their help he actually got the key moving, ignoring the fact that he was undoubtedly doing himself some damage, for a brown liquid issued from his mouth. "Listen," said the chief clerk in the next room. "He's turning the key." That was a great encouragement to Gregor, and imagining that they were all following his efforts with tense excitement, he bit furiously on the key with all his strength. As it turned, he danced round the lock. He was now holding himself up by his mouth alone, and as the situation demanded, either clung to the key or pressed it down again with the full weight of his body. With a sigh of relief, he said to himself, "I didn't need the locksmith after all," and laid his head on the handle to pull the door open. By opening it in this way, the door was actually open while he himself was still not visible. First, he had to edge his way round the wing of the door, and with the utmost care if he wasn't to fall flat on his back. He was still preoccupied with this tricky maneuver, and had no time to attend to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk utter a loud, "Ugh!" It sounded like a rush of wind, and now he could see him, standing closest to the door, pressing his hand to his mouth, backing slowly away. His mother, in spite of the chief clerk's presence, she was standing there with her hair all undone and tousled from the night, looked first with clasped hands at his father, then took 2 steps towards Gregor and slumped down. His father looked hostile and clenched a fist, as if he intended to beat Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly round the living room, shaded his eyes with his hands, and wept until his powerful chest shook. Gregor did not in fact enter the room at all, but leaned against the inside of the firmly bolted wing of the door, so all that could be seen was half of his body, and above it his head tilted to one side. In the meantime, it had grown much lighter. Clearly visible on the other side of the street was a section of the endless grey-black building opposite. It was a hospital. Hanging on the wall opposite was a photograph of Gregor from his army days, which showed him as a lieutenant, a carefree smile on his lips, inviting respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the hallway was open, and since the front door was open too, it was possible to see out onto the landing and to the top of the stairs. "Right," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one to have retained his composure. "I shall now get dressed and be off. Are you willing to let me work? Where are you going, sir? To the office? Will you make a faithful report of all this? I have my parents and sisters to think about. I'm in a tight spot, but I'll work my way out of it. Don't make things harder for me than they already are. Speak up for me in the firm. You, sir, you have a better view of things than the rest of the staff, and between you and me, than the head of the firm himself, who, in his capacity as employer, can easily allow his judgment to err to the disadvantage of an employee, and you know very well that the travelling salesman who's out of the office practically all year round can fall prey to gossip, coincidences, and unfounded complaints against which he's completely unable to defend himself. Sir, don't go away without telling me that you think I'm at least partly right." But the chief clerk had turned away at Gregor's very first words, merely staring back at him with curled lips over his quivering shoulder. He was already in the hallway, and to judge from the sudden movement with which he finally stepped from the living room, one might have thought he had just scorched the sole of his foot. Gregor realized that he could in no circumstances allow the chief clerk to depart in this frame of mind if his position in the firm were not to be seriously endangered. His parents did not understand these things too well. In the course of many years they had formed the conviction that Gregor was set up for life in this firm, and besides they were so preoccupied with their own immediate worries that they had completely lost the ability to look ahead. The chief clerk must be restrained, calmed down, convinced and finally won over. Gregor's future and that of his family depended on it. If only his sister had been there. She was clever, and surely the chief clerk, this ladies' man, would have allowed himself to be swayed by her. But since his sister was not there, Gregor had to act on his own. And without stopping to think that he was still wholly unfamiliar with his present powers of locomotion, without stopping to think that his words had possibly, even probably, not been understood again, he let go of the wing of the door. He shoved himself through the opening. He wanted to get to the chief clerk, but promptly fell as he groped for support onto his numerous little legs with a short cry. No sooner had this happened than, for the first time that morning, he felt a sense of physical well-being. His little legs had firm ground beneath them. They obeyed him completely, as he noted to his joy. They were even eager to carry him wherever he wanted to go, and he already believed that an end to all his suffering was finally at hand. But at that same moment his mother, who had seemed so utterly self-absorbed, suddenly leapt into the air, arms stretched out wide, crying, "Help! For God's sakes, help!" "Mother? Mother?" said Gregor softly, and looked up at her. At this, his mother let out another scream and fled into the arms of his father, who came rushing up to her. But Gregor now had no time for his parents. The chief clerk was already on the stairs. He darted forwards. The chief clerk must have suspected something, for he leapt down several steps and disappeared. He was still yelling, "Ah!" and it echoed through the whole staircase. Unfortunately, his father, who till then had remained relatively composed, seemed quite bewildered by the chief clerk's flight, for, instead of running after him, or at least not obstructing Gregor in his pursuit, he seized in his right hand the chief clerk's cane, which had been left behind, picked up with his left hand a large newspaper from the table, and, stamping his feet and brandishing both cane and newspaper, began to drive Gregor back into his room. Gregor's entreaties were to no avail. None were even understood. Relentlessly his father drove him back, hissing like a savage. Gregor, however, still had no practice in walking backwards, and was making very slow progress. If only he had been allowed to turn round, he could have reached his room in no time at all, but he was frightened of making his father impatient. Finally, however, Gregor had no alternative, for he noticed with horror that in reverse he could not even keep going in one direction. So he now began, with repeated and anguished sideways glances at his father, to turn round as quickly as he could, which was in reality very slowly. If only his father had not kept making those intolerable hissing noises! It threw Gregor into utter confusion. He'd almost turned himself round, when, with his mind continually on the hissing, he made an error, and started turning the other way. But when he finally succeeded in facing the doorway, it became clear to him that his body was too broad to pass through as it was. His father, of course, in his present state of mind, did not even consider opening the other wing of the door in order to give Gregor sufficient room. He was obsessed by the one idea of getting Gregor back to his room as quickly as possible. He drove him on as if there were no obstacle. It was now beyond a joke, and Gregor thrust himself, come what may, into the doorway. One side of his body rose up. He lay lopsided in the doorway. One of his flanks was rubbed quite raw. The white door was stained with ugly blotches. Soon he would be stuck fast, unable to move unaided. His little legs on one side hung quivering in the air. Those on the other squashed painfully against the floor, at which point his father dealt him a truly liberating blow from behind, and, bleeding profusely, Gregor flew into his room. The door was then slammed shut with the cane, and at last there was silence.
Benedict Cumberbatch was reading Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. The translator was Richard Stokes, and the series was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.